He wrapped his hand around the Black Maid's throat as if no one in the room would dare stop him. What he didn't know was that, at the very end of the marble hallway, Judgment had just walked through the front door. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments below, and if you believe every person deserves dignity, no matter their job or the color of their skin, don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, back to Brielle Foster. The Hawthorne estate glittered beneath a canopy of crystal chandeliers, every polished surface reflecting wealth that most people could never imagine touching. Waiters glided silently between guests dressed in tailored tuxedos and shimmering evening gowns. Soft piano music floated through the ballroom, while expensive champagne sparkled inside crystal flutes. It was the kind of night where appearances mattered more than truth, and smiles were often worth less than silence. For Brielle Foster, it was simply another shift. Her black uniform was perfectly pressed. Her natural curls were tied neatly beneath a modest headband. She carried herself with quiet confidence, never rushing despite the endless demands surrounding her. She had learned long ago that dignity wasn't something expensive clothes could buy. It was something a person carried within themselves, even when the world refused to notice. Champagne, a guest called impatiently. Right away, sir, Brielle answered with the same gentle smile she offered everyone. She approached a circle of wealthy investors gathered near the grand staircase. Standing at the center was Victor Hayes, a man whose tailored navy suit and arrogant grin seemed to compete for attention. Every laugh around him sounded forced, as though people feared disappointing him more than they enjoyed his company. Victor barely looked at Brielle as she poured the champagne. Then someone bumped her elbow. Only a few golden drops splashed onto Victor's hand. The ballroom fell strangely quiet. Victor slowly looked down at the tiny stain before lifting his eyes toward Brielle. His expression hardened. "You stupid girl." His voice sliced through the music. Brielle immediately lowered her head. "I'm terribly sorry, sir. It was an accident." She reached into the folded towel draped over her arm. "I'll clean it immediately." Victor slapped the towel away before she could touch his sleeve. The white cloth landed on the polished marble floor. Several nearby guests exchanged amused glances. One woman covered her mouth to hide a smile. Another quietly whispered something that made her husband chuckle. No one stepped forward. "I'm talking," Victor said coldly. "Look at me when I speak." Brielle slowly raised her eyes. Not with defiance. Not with fear. Only respect. "I'm very sorry, sir." Victor took one slow step closer. "You think saying sorry fixes everything?" His voice grew louder, making conversations across the ballroom fade one after another. People turned. Phones discreetly appeared beneath tables. Curiosity spread faster than the violin melody still echoing through the room. Brielle kept both hands folded in front of her. "I'll pay for the cleaning if necessary." Victor laughed. "You?" The word dripped with contempt. "Do you even make enough money to pay for this suit?" A ripple of laughter passed through the guests. Brielle remained silent. Her cheeks warmed, but her breathing stayed steady. She had survived far worse than cruel words. She simply wanted the evening to end. Victor leaned closer until only inches separated them. "You people are unbelievable. You serve drinks for one night, and suddenly think you're equal to everyone else." The ballroom became painfully still. Even the musicians hesitated. Mrs. Evelyn Carter, the estate's head housekeeper, started moving through the crowd, her face pale with concern. But two security guards gently blocked her path. Neither of them had received permission to intervene. Victor suddenly grabbed Brielle's wrist. Hard. She gasped softly but didn't resist. "You don't walk away until I say you can." His fingers tightened. The tray slipped from Brielle's trembling hand. Crystal glasses exploded across the marble floor. The sharp sound echoed through the mansion like breaking ice. Several guests stepped backward. Others simply watched. Victor's face twisted with anger. Then, in one swift movement, his hand rose from her wrist and wrapped around her throat. Brielle instinctively reached for his arm, her breathing catching as his grip tightened. The room froze. No music. No conversation. Only the sound of shattered glass settling across the floor. And at that exact moment, the massive oak doors at the entrance opened without announcement. A tall man in an immaculate black suit stepped inside. His polished shoes stopped the instant his eyes found the crowd gathered around the struggling maid. Behind him, several silent bodyguards halted without a word. No introductions were needed. No one noticed the subtle change in the air. But for those who truly understood power, the most dangerous man in the room had just witnessed everything. Victor Hayes had wrapped his fingers around Brielle Foster's throat for less than 5 seconds. Yet the silence that settled over the ballroom felt old enough to belong to history itself. No one moved. Not the investors who had laughed only moments earlier. Not the women draped in diamonds. Not the musicians frozen beside their grand piano. Fear had a peculiar sound. It wasn't screaming. It was absolute silence. Brielle could barely draw a breath. Victor's grip wasn't crushing her airway completely, but it was firm enough to remind everyone in the room that he believed another human being belonged beneath him. Her dark eyes remained steady despite the pain spreading through her neck. She didn't claw at his hand. She didn't beg. She simply whispered through strained breaths. "Please, sir." Victor leaned closer, his expensive cologne mixing with the sharp scent of spilled champagne. "Now you remember your manners." His friends chuckled. "That's better. You people only understand discipline." Another laugh. Someone quietly raised a phone beneath the edge of the banquet table. Another guest followed. Within seconds, tiny camera lenses were secretly recording what no one had the courage to stop. Mrs. Evelyn Carter pushed against the growing crowd. "Mr. Hayes, please. She's one of our employees." It was an accident. Victor never even looked at her. "I wasn't speaking to you." His voice was calm. That made it worse. People expected angry men to shout. Victor smiled. Cruelty came naturally to him. Brielle's knees weakened slightly. Not because she was afraid. Because oxygen was becoming difficult to find. Still, she refused to look defeated. She remembered something her grandmother had told her years ago while polishing old church pews back in Savannah. Never let another person's hatred decide how you carry yourself. They can steal comfort. They can steal money. They can even steal opportunity. But dignity only leaves when you hand it away. So Brielle remained standing, straight-backed, silent, even with a stranger's hand around her throat. Across the ballroom, Ethan Brooks had not taken another step since entering the estate. His tailored black suit seemed almost invisible beneath the warm chandelier light, but every member of his security team immediately noticed the subtle shift in his posture. He wasn't looking at Victor. Not entirely. He was watching everyone else. Every face, every reaction, every choice. A young banker lowered his eyes. An elderly senator pretended to adjust his cufflinks. One businessman quietly stepped backward, careful not to become involved. No one helped her. Ethan's expression never changed. Years inside a world built on violence had taught him something most people never understood. A person's character wasn't revealed when everything was comfortable. It revealed itself during the exact moment kindness became inconvenient. Tonight, the ballroom was taking an exam, and nearly everyone was failing. One of Ethan's bodyguards leaned slightly toward him. "Boss." Ethan lifted one finger. The bodyguard immediately fell silent. No orders. Not yet. Meanwhile, Victor tightened his grip another fraction. "You've embarrassed me. You think saying sorry fixes humiliation?" Brielle swallowed painfully. "I'm truly sorry." Victor laughed again. "I don't want your apology. I want everyone here to remember what happens when staff forget their place." Several guests nodded awkwardly, desperate to stay on Victor's good side. Others looked away completely. Their silence became its own form of agreement. A crystal glass rolled slowly across the marble floor, before finally stopping near Ethan's polished shoe. He looked down at it for only a second, then back toward Brielle. She wasn't crying. That surprised him. Most people cried. Most people pleaded. Most people looked for someone to rescue them. She looked only exhausted, as though life had already taught her this kind of humiliation long before tonight. Something cold settled behind Ethan's dark eyes. Not rage. Something quieter. Far more dangerous. Mrs. Evelyn tried once more. "Please let her go." Victor glanced toward the older housekeeper with visible annoyance. "You people really don't know when to stay quiet." Then he looked back at Brielle. "Maybe kneeling will help you remember your station." His free hand shoved against her shoulder. The force was enough to throw her slightly off balance. Her shoes slid across polished marble. Several guests gasped. Victor's smile widened. He enjoyed having an audience. He raised his hand again, preparing to force her completely onto her knees. That was the moment Ethan Brooks finally began walking. No hurry, no anger visible on his face. Each polished step echoed softly across the silent ballroom. Click, click, click. The sound alone was enough to make conversations die before they even began. Bodyguards followed several paces behind him without speaking. Guests instinctively moved aside. No one asked them to. Something about the tall Korean man approaching through the sea of evening gowns and tuxedos made people step away without understanding why. Victor barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on Brielle. He had no idea that the only thing more dangerous than a man who exploded in anger was a man who walked toward injustice without raising his voice. Every powerful man eventually discovers the moment when everyone stops pretending. For Victor Hayes, that moment arrived with 3 quiet footsteps from a stranger he had never bothered to notice. Click, click, click. The sound echoed across the marble ballroom with almost unnatural precision. Victor finally lifted his eyes from Brielle. His fingers remained around her throat. "Can I help you?" he asked with a smirk, clearly irritated that someone had interrupted his performance. The tall Korean man stopped several feet away. His black tailored suit fit with effortless perfection. His dark hair was neatly swept back, revealing sharp features carved with the calm confidence of someone who had never needed to prove his authority. His expression remained unreadable, neither angry nor sympathetic. His eyes settled briefly on Brielle. She was struggling to breathe. A faint red mark had already begun forming beneath Victor's fingers. Then his gaze shifted back to Victor. The room waited. No one knew the stranger's name, but everyone instinctively felt that something had changed. The temperature seemed colder. Even the chandeliers appeared less warm. Victor broke the silence first. "This doesn't concern you." The Korean man answered in a voice so quiet that everyone leaned forward without realizing it. "Take your hand off her." No shouting. No threats. Just 6 simple words. Victor blinked, then laughed. Several of his friends joined him. "You hear that?" He glanced toward the crowd. "The bodyguard thinks he's giving orders." A few uneasy chuckles answered him. Nobody laughed for long. The stranger hadn't moved. Neither had the 6 men standing several yards behind him. Each wore identical black suits. Each stood perfectly still. None looked at Victor. They looked only at their leader. Waiting. Always waiting. Victor squeezed Brielle's throat slightly harder, determined to show everyone that he feared no one. "What if I don't?" The stranger tilted his head ever so slightly. For the first time, a flicker of disappointment crossed his face. Not anger. Disappointment. As though Victor had just confirmed something unpleasant but inevitable. Brielle finally found enough breath to speak. "Sir." Her voice was barely audible. "You don't have to." She wasn't trying to save herself. She was trying to prevent another confrontation. That alone made the stranger study her more carefully. Even while being humiliated, she was worried about someone else. Mrs. Evelyn stepped closer again. "Please, everyone. We can solve this peacefully." Victor ignored her completely. His ego had become larger than the room itself. "You know what's wrong with people today?" he announced loudly. "They've forgotten their place." He looked directly into Brielle's eyes. "Staff are staff. They clean. They serve. They obey." A few guests lowered their heads in embarrassment. Others pretended to check their watches. One elderly woman quietly wiped tears from the corner of her eye. Still, nobody intervened. The stranger observed every face. The investor who laughed. The woman who looked away. The young server trembling behind the champagne cart. The security guards pretending uncertainty. He memorized them all. Power wasn't simply knowing who your enemies were. It was knowing who remained silent while evil stood directly in front of them. Victor released Brielle's throat only long enough to shove her violently backward. She stumbled. Her heel caught the edge of the broken crystal scattered across the floor. Unable to recover her balance, she fell hard onto one knee. The impact echoed through the silent ballroom. A thin shard sliced across her palm as she instinctively reached toward the floor. Blood appeared almost instantly, bright crimson against polished white marble. She inhaled sharply but refused to cry out. Victor looked down at her with visible satisfaction. "There. That looks more appropriate." A wave of disgust spread across several faces. Yet still, silence. Brielle slowly gathered herself. Her injured hand trembled as tiny drops of blood fell beside the shattered champagne glasses. She lowered her head, not in surrender, but simply to steady her breathing. The stranger watched the blood reach the marble. Something inside him finally shifted. Not explosively, not dramatically, simply, completely. He remembered another polished floor many years ago, a frightened woman kneeling after being struck by a wealthy customer. His own mother. He had been only 12, too weak to stop it, too powerless to protect the only person who had ever protected him. He had sworn that day that if power ever belonged to him, no innocent person would kneel while he remained standing. The memory disappeared as quickly as it had come. His dark eyes returned to Brielle, then to the blood, then to Victor. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried the same calm certainty as before. Only this time, every syllable sounded like the beginning of a verdict. I gave you a chance, and you chose humiliation. The ballroom became so quiet that the faint sound of Brielle's blood touching the marble could almost be heard. No one realized it yet, but the party had already ended. What remained was judgment. Sometimes justice does not begin with anger. Sometimes it begins with a single sentence spoken so quietly that only the guilty recognize its weight. Victor Hayes stared at the Korean man with open amusement. I chose humiliation, he repeated, letting out another laugh. Who exactly are you supposed to be? The question lingered in the silent ballroom. The stranger answered without the slightest change in expression. My name is Ethan Brooks. Nothing more. No titles. No introductions. To most of the guests, it was merely another name. But at the far end of the ballroom, one elderly banker suddenly went pale. His champagne glass slipped slightly in his trembling hand. Another guest, a shipping executive from Busan, stiffened the instant he heard the name. He whispered to the woman beside him. Oh no. She frowned. What? He swallowed hard. If that's really Ethan Brooks. He never finished the sentence. Across the room, Victor noticed none of it. He was too busy enjoying the attention. Congratulations, Ethan. You've got confidence. But unless you're planning to write me a strongly worded letter. His eyes dropped toward Brielle, still kneeling beside the shattered crystal. This conversation is over. He reached toward her again. This time Ethan moved. Only one step. It wasn't fast. It wasn't threatening. Yet Victor instinctively stopped. Not because of fear. Because something in Ethan's eyes felt impossible to ignore. There was no hatred there. Only certainty. The certainty of a man who had already decided how the night would end. Ethan slowly removed a pristine white handkerchief from the inside pocket of his jacket. He didn't offer it to Victor. He walked directly past him, without asking permission, without acknowledging his existence. The movement was so unexpected that Victor simply stared. Ethan stopped in front of Brielle. She remained on one knee, her injured hand resting against the marble floor. Tiny drops of blood still formed beneath her fingers. She immediately lowered her eyes. I'm sorry, sir. I made a mess. For the first time that evening, Ethan's expression softened. Not because of the blood, not because of the humiliation, because despite everything she had endured, she was apologizing for the broken glasses. Not for herself, for the inconvenience caused to others. He knelt. The richest men in the ballroom unconsciously held their breath. A man like Ethan Brooks did not kneel. Not for politicians. Not for billionaires. Not for kings. Yet there he was, one knee touching polished marble. He gently unfolded the white handkerchief and wrapped it around Brielle's bleeding palm with careful precision. His movements were steady, respectful, almost fatherly. You have nothing to apologize for, he said quietly. Those 7 words echoed more loudly than any shout. Brielle looked at him in confusion. Her eyes glistened, though she refused to cry. I spilled the champagne. It was an accident, Ethan answered. You were assaulted. There was no emotion in his voice. Only fact. Mrs. Evelyn covered her mouth. Several staff members lowered their heads, unable to hide their tears. They had worked in wealthy homes for decades. No owner had ever spoken those words to one of them. Victor scoffed loudly. Oh, give me a break. You act like she's royalty. Ethan rose slowly to his full height. His attention shifted back toward Victor. No, I treat her like a human being. Silence. Complete. Unbroken. Victor rolled his eyes dramatically. Human being? She's a maid. Ethan answered almost immediately. And tonight. His gaze swept across every guest in the ballroom. She is the only person here who has behaved with dignity. The sentence struck the room like a hammer. Several guests instinctively looked down. They remembered their laughter, their silence, their phones secretly recording while doing nothing to help. Shame spread quietly from face to face. Victor refused to feel any of it. Instead, he clapped sarcastically. Beautiful speech. Very inspiring. But here's reality. He stepped closer until he stood directly in front of Ethan. I own companies. I finance governments. I decide who gets rich. And you're standing in my way because of a maid. He smiled with absolute confidence. You've chosen the wrong side. For the first time that evening, a faint smile appeared on Ethan Brooks' face. It wasn't friendly. It wasn't mocking. It was the smile of a man who had finally heard exactly what he needed. You believe this is about choosing sides. His voice remained calm. It isn't. Victor frowned. Ethan looked directly into his eyes. It's about reminding you that no amount of money has ever made cruelty respectable. Somewhere behind Ethan, 6 men in black suits quietly straightened their posture. No commands had been spoken. None were necessary. Every one of them recognized the same thing. Their boss had finished listening. The judgment was about to begin. The most terrifying verdict is never shouted. It is spoken by a man who has already decided there is nothing left to discuss. Victor Hayes laughed once more, louder than before, hoping confidence could drown the strange uneasiness creeping into his chest. Judgment, he scoffed. You think you're going to judge me? He spread his arms toward the ballroom, as if inviting applause. I've donated millions to charities. I've built companies. I've got senators calling me every week. He pointed toward Brielle without even looking at her. And she's a maid. The final words landed with deliberate cruelty. Several guests forced weak smiles. No one dared laugh this time. The room had changed. People could feel it. They simply couldn't explain it. Ethan Brooks slipped the blood-stained handkerchief from his fingers after making certain Brielle's injured hand was securely wrapped. He turned calmly toward one of his men. Help her stand. Yes, boss. The answer came instantly. The bodyguard stepped forward with quiet respect, offering Brielle his hand as though escorting an honored guest rather than a servant. She hesitated. No one had ever treated her this way inside a wealthy home. Not once. Slowly, she accepted his help. Victor watched with growing irritation. This is ridiculous. He stepped forward again. She isn't going anywhere. His hand reached toward Brielle's arm. Before his fingers could touch her, a second bodyguard silently moved between them. There was no threatening gesture. No clenched fists. Only an immovable wall of discipline. Victor stopped. For the first time that evening, someone had denied him. His face darkened. Move. The bodyguard didn't answer. He simply stood there. Victor looked past him toward Ethan. Tell your security dog to get out of my way. Ethan remained perfectly composed. I don't repeat myself. Another silence. Longer than the last. Victor's fiancée, Chloe Bennett, finally stepped closer, her voice trembling. Victor, I think we should just leave. He glared at her. Stay out of this. She immediately fell silent. Even she understood that his pride had become more important than reason. Across the ballroom, whispers spread like invisible smoke. I've seen him before. Who is he? Why are those men calling him boss? I don't like this. An older Japanese businessman quietly removed his glasses. He stared at Ethan for several seconds before his face lost all color. He leaned toward the executive beside him. That's Brooks. The executive frowned. You know him? I know enough. His voice dropped almost to a whisper. If he's here, Victor has made the worst mistake of his life. Word traveled quietly from guest to guest. No one announced it aloud. No one needed to. Eyes began shifting toward Ethan with growing uncertainty. Toward Victor, with something closer to pity. Victor noticed the change. His confidence wavered for only an instant. Then pride rushed in to replace it. So what? He laughed. Everyone suddenly acts scared because some Korean businessman showed up? Ethan finally answered. I'm not asking anyone to be afraid. Victor folded his arms. Good. Because I'm not. Ethan gave a slight nod. I know. And that is exactly why this became necessary. Victor frowned. What are you talking about? Ethan looked toward one of his senior bodyguards. The man immediately stepped forward. No words were exchanged. He simply handed Ethan a sleek black phone. The ballroom watched every movement. Ethan unlocked the screen, tapped it once, then placed a single call. No speaker, no dramatic speech. When the person answered, Ethan spoke only one sentence. Freeze every active agreement connected to Victor Hayes. He listened for 2 seconds. Effective immediately. The call ended. That was all. Victor burst into laughter. Is that supposed to impress me? You made one phone call. So what? Ethan returned the phone without replying. 5 seconds passed. Then another. The ballroom remained motionless. Suddenly, a vibration echoed from Victor's jacket pocket. He ignored it. Another vibration. Then another. His phone continued buzzing without pause. Annoyed, he pulled it from his pocket. 3 missed calls. Then 7. Then 12. Messages flooded across the screen faster than he could read them. His smile faded slightly. Before he could unlock the phone, Chloe gasped. My phone. Around the ballroom, more phones began vibrating. An investor stared silently at his screen. A shipping executive stepped away to answer a call. A banker whispered an apology before rushing toward the exit. Within seconds, conversations erupted across every corner of the ballroom. What do you mean the deal is suspended? Cancelled? Effective now? Who ordered this? Victor looked up, confusion replacing arrogance. What the hell is happening? No one answered him, because everyone was too busy watching their own world begin to shift. Ethan Brooks never moved. His hands rested calmly behind his back. His breathing remained slow and steady. He wasn't enjoying Victor's panic. He wasn't celebrating. He was simply allowing consequences to arrive, like waves reaching a shore that had always been waiting for them. And for the first time since grabbing Brielle by the throat, Victor Hayes realized that the most dangerous man in the room had never needed to raise his voice. Power rarely destroys a man in a single blow. More often, it simply removes the illusion that he was ever untouchable. Victor Hayes stared at the screen of his phone, refreshing it. Again and again, as if reality might change out of embarrassment. It didn't. The first message came from his chief financial officer. Urgent. Every transfer has been suspended. Call me immediately. Another appeared before he could finish reading. Northbridge Capital has withdrawn from tomorrow's acquisition. Then another. The board is requesting an emergency meeting. Another. All pending contracts have been placed under review. Victor's heartbeat quickened. This wasn't coincidence. It couldn't be. He looked sharply toward Ethan Brooks. What did you do? Ethan answered without looking at him. I opened a door. Victor laughed nervously. You expect me to believe one phone call caused this? No. Ethan finally met his eyes. I expect you to understand that your reputation caused this. The sentence settled over the ballroom like winter frost. Victor's phone rang again. This time he answered immediately. Mark, what the hell is happening? The voice on the other end sounded panicked. Victor, we've got a serious problem. Our banking partners just froze the restructuring. What? They won't explain. They only said. The executive hesitated. They're no longer comfortable being associated with you. Victor's face hardened. That's impossible. I've worked with them for 12 years. I know. They still said no. The line went dead. Another call arrived before he could lower the phone. Then another. Then another. He ignored them all. Around him, guests quietly stepped farther away. Not dramatically, just enough to avoid standing beside him. A moment earlier, they had surrounded him. Now an empty circle had formed. Invisible. Humiliating. Chloe noticed it too. She whispered, almost pleading. Victor, we should leave. He snapped without turning. Stop talking. She flinched. For the first time in years, she realized she wasn't standing beside a powerful man. She was standing beside a frightened one. Across the ballroom, Ethan slowly approached Brielle once more. She had remained silent throughout everything. Watching, trying to understand why a complete stranger was risking so much for someone he had never met. She looked at the bandage wrapped around her hand, then at Ethan. You really don't have to do this for me. His expression remained calm. This isn't only for you. She frowned slightly. What do you mean? Ethan glanced across the ballroom. Every person working tonight is watching. Brielle followed his gaze. Servers, housekeepers, kitchen staff, security personnel. Every employee had quietly gathered near the edges of the room. Some still held trays. Others clutched folded towels. Every pair of eyes was fixed on Ethan. He continued softly. If cruelty goes unanswered, they learn they are alone. If dignity is defended, they remember they matter. Brielle lowered her eyes. Those words reached somewhere deep inside her. Somewhere she had protected for years. Mrs. Evelyn quietly wiped another tear away. She had spent 4 decades working in luxury estates. Never once had an owner spoken about employees with such respect. Meanwhile, Victor refused to surrender. He stuffed his phone into his pocket and forced another smile. This isn't over. You think you scared a few investors? I'll recover. I always do. Ethan nodded once. I hope you recover. Victor blinked. The answer confused him. I wasn't talking about your business. Silence. I was talking about your character. Victor opened his mouth. Nothing came out. For perhaps the first time in his adult life, someone had spoken to him without fear, without admiration, without needing anything from him. Only truth. The ballroom doors opened once again. This time, several men and women in expensive suits entered quickly. Victor recognized them instantly. His legal counsel, his chief operations officer, his private accountant. None of them looked relieved to see him. The accountant walked straight toward Victor, his face pale. We need to leave. Now. Victor frowned. What happened? The man hesitated before answering. Our insurers terminated coverage. Our primary lender suspended every active facility. And he swallowed. Our largest investors are resigning. Victor stared at him in disbelief. All of them. The accountant slowly nodded. They said. He glanced briefly toward Ethan Brooks before lowering his voice. They refused to stand beside a man accused of assaulting a defenseless employee. Victor's breathing became uneven. He looked around the ballroom one last time. No applause. No allies. No laughter. Only hundreds of silent eyes looking back at him. Not with admiration. Not even with hatred. With disappointment. And in that unbearable silence, Victor finally understood something money had never been able to teach him. A man can lose his fortune over time, but he can lose the respect of an entire room. In a single moment. Justice is never complete when the guilty lose everything. It is complete only when the forgotten finally remember their own worth. Victor Hayes no longer looked like the man who had entered the ballroom an hour earlier. His immaculate suit remained perfectly tailored. His expensive watch still gleamed beneath the crystal lights. Nothing about his appearance had changed. Yet somehow, everything had. He stood alone in the middle of the ballroom, while conversations continued around him without inviting him back inside them. People avoided his eyes. Investors quietly walked past him. Executives who had once rushed to shake his hand now found urgent reasons to study the marble floor instead. The silence surrounding him had become heavier than any insult. Victor turned desperately toward Ethan Brooks. You've made your point. His voice had lost its sharpness. What do you want? Ethan answered almost immediately. I wanted you to stop. Victor frowned. Stop what? Hurting someone who had done nothing to deserve it. Another long silence followed. Victor looked toward Brielle. She stood quietly beside Mrs. Evelyn, her injured hand resting gently against the white bandage Ethan had wrapped around it. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't celebrating. She wasn't watching Victor with satisfaction. She simply looked tired. That expression unsettled him more than anger ever could. You've ruined my life. Victor muttered. Ethan's gaze never left him. No, you began doing that long before tonight. The words landed with quiet precision. For the first time, Victor had no answer. One by one, the guests began approaching Ethan. Not to flatter him. Not to seek favors. To apologize. The elderly banker removed his glasses. I should have intervened. I didn't. I'm ashamed. Ethan gave a single nod. The banker then walked toward Brielle. He bowed his head. I'm sorry. She blinked in surprise. You don't owe me. I do. He interrupted gently. I watched. I did nothing. His confession opened something inside the room. A woman in an emerald evening gown stepped forward next. I laughed. I shouldn't have. Another guest admitted quietly. I recorded everything. I was afraid. Then another. And I looked away. Soon the ballroom no longer sounded like a celebration. It sounded like a room full of people confronting themselves for the first time. Brielle didn't know what to say. She had spent years believing people like these never apologized. Yet one after another, they did. Not because Ethan ordered them. Because his actions had forced them to see themselves honestly. Mrs. Evelyn gently squeezed Brielle's shoulder. You changed something tonight. Brielle shook her head softly. No, I didn't. Mrs. Evelyn smiled through her tears. Sometimes surviving is enough. Across the room, Chloe Bennett quietly removed the diamond engagement ring from her finger. Victor noticed. What are you doing? Her voice remained calm. I kept telling myself this wasn't who you really were. She placed the ring into his trembling hand. But tonight, I saw exactly who you chose to become. Victor stared at the ring in disbelief. Chloe, she stepped backward. I can't build a future with someone who thinks another person's dignity is disposable. Without another word, she walked away. Victor reached after her instinctively. She never looked back. For the first time all evening, his shoulders sank. Not because he had lost money, not because contracts had disappeared, because the last person who truly believed in him had stopped. Ethan watched quietly. There was no satisfaction in his face, only sadness. He understood that moments like this changed lives forever, sometimes for the better, sometimes too late. He slowly crossed the marble floor until he stood beside Brielle once more. The ballroom instinctively fell silent. He looked toward every employee gathered around the walls. Housekeepers, dishwashers, servers, gardeners, drivers. People who usually disappeared into the background before wealthy guests even noticed they existed. Tonight, they were the center of the room. Ethan spoke clearly enough for everyone to hear. I don't care what position you hold. I don't care how much money you have. If you work beneath this roof, you stand beneath my protection. Several employees lowered their heads, overcome with emotion. Others quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Brielle felt her throat tighten. No one had ever spoken words like those on their behalf. Not publicly, not proudly. Ethan turned to her one final time. You came here tonight to serve others. His voice softened. You should never have been treated as though your humanity was part of the service. The ballroom remained absolutely still. In that profound silence, every guest understood that the evening was no longer about a disgraced businessman. It was about a woman who had never asked for power, yet had reminded an entire room what dignity truly looked like. The greatest act of respect is not spoken in front of a crowd. It is shown after the crowd has already gone home. The ballroom slowly began to empty. Conversations returned, but they were different now. The laughter was quieter. The handshakes felt more genuine. Guests who had arrived to celebrate wealth left carrying something far more uncomfortable. Self-reflection. Victor Hayes stood near the entrance surrounded by lawyers and advisors, yet he had never looked more isolated. No one approached him anymore. No one asked for photographs. No one waited for his opinion. The attention he had spent years collecting had disappeared in a single evening. As security escorted him toward the waiting cars outside, he glanced back one final time. Not toward Ethan Brooks, toward Brielle Foster. She was helping another housekeeper gather the broken crystal from the marble floor. Even after everything that had happened, she had returned to work. Victor lowered his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt ashamed. The doors closed behind him. His footsteps disappeared into the night. Inside the mansion, the atmosphere changed completely. The musicians quietly packed away their instruments. Servers collected untouched glasses of champagne. Fresh flowers still decorated the tables, their fragrance filling the now peaceful ballroom. Mrs. Evelyn approached Brielle with gentle concern. My dear, you should go home. Brielle smiled softly. There are still tables to clear. Mrs. Evelyn shook her head. There will always be tables. There won't always be people who remind us why our work matters. Brielle looked down at her bandaged hand. I don't feel like I did anything. Mrs. Evelyn laughed quietly through damp eyes. That's exactly why you did. A few steps away, Ethan stood near one of the tall windows overlooking the estate gardens. Rain had begun falling outside. Tiny drops slid across the glass while the lights from the courtyard shimmered beneath them. One of his senior bodyguards approached. The vehicles are ready, boss. Ethan nodded, then looked back toward Brielle. 1 minute. The bodyguard respectfully stepped away. Ethan walked across the ballroom until he stood beside Brielle once again. She immediately straightened. Mr. Brooks. He looked at the cleaning cloth in her uninjured hand. You don't have to finish this. She smiled politely. I know. I just don't like leaving work unfinished. Ethan allowed himself the faintest smile. My mother used to say the same thing. Brielle looked up, surprised. Your mother? He nodded. She worked in houses much like this. The words caught Brielle off guard. She had never imagined someone like Ethan sharing anything about his personal life. Was she a housekeeper? For many years. His answer came without hesitation. People rarely remembered her name. But I did. His eyes drifted briefly across the polished ballroom. I also remembered the way some people spoke to her. The silence between them no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. Brielle finally understood. He hadn't stepped forward tonight because of status. He hadn't intervened to impress anyone. He had seen his own past reflected in hers. I'm sorry, she whispered. Ethan slowly shook his head. Don't be. I spent years wishing someone had protected her. He looked directly at Brielle. Tonight, I finally had the chance to protect someone. Neither of them spoke for several moments. Words were no longer necessary. Nearby, several employees quietly watched the conversation. Not because they wanted gossip, because hope looked unfamiliar. One young waiter leaned toward another. "Did you hear what he said earlier?" The second nodded. "If you work beneath this roof, you stand beneath my protection." The young waiter smiled. "No one has ever said that to us." Across the ballroom, Mrs. Evelyn began gathering every employee together. Housekeepers, kitchen assistants, drivers, gardeners, maintenance workers. Nearly 30 people stood in a quiet line. They weren't summoned. They simply wanted to thank the man who had reminded them that they mattered. As Ethan prepared to leave, every employee bowed their heads respectfully. Not out of fear, out of gratitude. He looked at each face before speaking. Take care of one another. When someone is treated without dignity, stand beside them. Don't wait for someone like me. The employees nodded silently. Those words would remain with them long after the chandeliers were switched off. As Ethan turned toward the entrance, Brielle suddenly called after him. "Mr. Brooks?" He stopped. She hesitated before speaking. "Thank you for seeing me." Ethan looked back with calm eyes. "I didn't do anything extraordinary." He paused. "I simply refused to look away." The rain continued falling beyond the great glass windows. The ballroom grew quiet once more. But this time, the silence no longer belonged to fear. It belonged to respect. The world rarely remembers the richest man in the room. It remembers the one who chose compassion when everyone else chose silence. 3 months later, autumn sunlight poured gently through the tall windows of the Hawthorne estate, replacing the cold rain that had marked the unforgettable night of the charity gala. The mansion looked exactly as it always had. Fresh flowers decorated the entrance. Crystal chandeliers sparkled overhead. The marble floors reflected every beam of morning light. Yet those who worked there knew something had changed forever. Not the building, the people inside it. Brielle Foster walked through the front doors carrying a small tray of fresh coffee for the morning meeting. Her hand had healed completely. Only a faint, nearly invisible scar remained across her palm. She never tried to hide it. To her, it was no longer a reminder of pain. It was proof that dignity could survive cruelty. As she crossed the grand hallway, every employee she passed greeted her with genuine smiles. "Morning, Brielle." "Good morning. How's your mother doing?" "She's much better, thank you." Kindness had become ordinary inside the estate. Not because new rules had been written, because people had witnessed what respect looked like when someone powerful chose to practice it instead of merely speaking about it. Near the entrance, a newly hired young housekeeper nervously adjusted her uniform. It was her first day. She looked overwhelmed by the size of the mansion. Brielle noticed immediately. She walked over with the same gentle smile she had carried on the night everything changed. "You don't have to rush." The young woman looked embarrassed. "I'm afraid I'll make a mistake." Brielle chuckled softly. "So was I." She carefully straightened the young employee's name badge. "If something spills, we clean it together. If you need help, you ask. And if anyone ever forgets to treat you with respect." She paused. "They answer to all of us." The young housekeeper smiled with visible relief. For the first time since arriving, she stood a little taller. Across the room, Ethan Brooks watched the exchange from his office doorway. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Mrs. Evelyn stepped beside him with a warm smile. "You see it too." Ethan nodded. "It spreads." Mrs. Evelyn looked toward Brielle. "Respect always does." Before the morning meeting began, Ethan walked into the ballroom where every employee had quietly gathered. Drivers, gardeners, chefs, servers, housekeepers, security staff. No luxurious gala filled the room this time. Only the people who made the estate function every single day. Ethan stood before them with his hands calmly folded behind his back. "I have only one thing to say." The room became completely silent. "The reputation of this house will never again be measured by the wealth of its guests." He slowly looked across every familiar face. "It will be measured by how safely the weakest person can walk through these doors." Several employees exchanged emotional glances. Some quietly smiled. Others fought back tears. No applause followed. Respect didn't need applause, only understanding. After the meeting ended, Brielle stepped outside into the gardens carrying a basket of fresh flowers. Golden leaves drifted lazily through the autumn air. The world felt quieter, healthier. She paused beside the stone fountain where children from a nearby charity center laughed, while chasing one another across the lawn. One little girl accidentally tripped. Before anyone else reacted, Brielle hurried over and gently helped her stand. The child brushed the dirt from her knees. "I'm okay." Brielle smiled. "I know." She carefully tucked a loose curl behind the girl's ear. The child looked up curiously. "Are you important here?" Brielle laughed softly. "No, I just work here." The little girl thought for a moment before shaking her head. "My teacher says important people are the ones who help others." Brielle's smile grew warmer. Perhaps the child was right. At that same moment, Ethan looked through the office window toward the gardens. He watched Brielle comforting the little girl beneath the autumn sunlight. Not seeking recognition, not expecting gratitude, simply choosing kindness because it was part of who she was. A faint smile appeared across his face. It was the same quiet smile he had worn the night justice finally arrived. Some victories never appear in newspapers. Some heroes never stand on stages. Some acts of courage begin with nothing more than refusing to look away when another human being is suffering. The scar on Brielle's hand would fade. The broken crystal would long since have been replaced. The guests would eventually forget the menu, the music, and the expensive champagne. But no one who had stood inside that ballroom would ever forget the moment a powerful Korean Mafia boss knelt before a frightened Black Maid to protect the one thing money could never buy: human dignity. And on that day, the world remembered what dignity truly looks like.